Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of a new series here on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. My name is Anton Garcia-Fernandez, and I am talking to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. And this is the first episode in a new series that I'm going to be calling Say Don't You Remember. Well, I know you're not here to listen to me sing, but that's what it's going to be called, Say Don't You Remember. And it's going to be basically taking a line from that great song from the Depression era, Brother Can You Spare a Dime by Jay Gorney. We're going to be talking about different jazz musicians and crooners and movie stars that are forgotten or should be rediscovered, are in need of rediscovery, and that's what we're trying to do here, talking about them, trying to bring them back a little bit, and honor their memory. And this first episode is going to deal with a movie star from the 1920s and 30s who was pretty well known even before she married the great crooner Bing Crosby. I'm talking about Dixie Lee Crosby, and to talk about her, to discuss her life, her career, and a historical marker that's going to honor her memory in her hometown of Harriman, Tennessee, I would like to welcome into the show, and this is a series of sometimes videos and sometimes podcasts. This is going to be a podcast, simply an audio recording of a conversation with Mr. Chris Hammond. Chris, welcome to Say Don't You Remember.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a privilege to be here to help promote Dixie Lee's memory and legacy, and I'm very pleased with what you're doing.
Well, Chris, you are a high school teacher, public high school teacher in Knox County, Tennessee, around the Knoxville area. And for a while, you've been interested in Dixie Lee Crosby, who was born in Harriman. You are right now talking to us from somewhere not too far from her hometown. Now, let's talk a little bit about how, when, and why you became interested in the figure of Dixie Lee Crosby.
Yeah, so, ever since I was a kid, I've always had an interest in Golden Age Hollywood. Man, I remember watching the old movies on Turner Classic Movies. And to give you a little perspective, I'm in my mid-30s, so I grew up watching a lot of those older films on there, especially Westerns, and I love film noir and all that. So, I've always been a huge fan of Golden Age Hollywood stuff, and I'm also a huge fan of local East Tennessee history. And that's kind of where I first came across Dixie Lee. A few years ago, just researching some local history here and local individuals that were famous from East Tennessee. I'd come across her name, and I'd heard it before, but I didn't really know a whole lot about her. And that's when I started researching more and more about her, and learning that she was an East Tennessee native, and that she's largely been forgotten, not just here locally, but in general. I think across the board, she's kind of been forgotten and kind of fallen through the cracks a little bit. So, I'm the type of person that, when I want to learn more about something, I like to dig as deep as I can and research as much as I can about the history. I just find it fascinating. I'll spend a lot of my lunch breaks and my free time just reading old articles and newspaper articles, looking at genealogy stuff, those type of things. So that's how I kind of got initially interested in her. And when I found out that she was from East Tennessee, that piqued my interest even more. And then when I started discovering film clips and audio and pictures of her, I was hooked. So that's how I kind of got my start on it.
Well, Dixie Lee was from, as we said just a few minutes ago, Harriman, Tennessee, and that happens to be a town that I know pretty well, simply because my in-laws live in North Carolina, and so my wife and I from Jackson, Tennessee, drive all the way on Interstate I-40, and somewhere along the way, somewhere in between Nashville and Knoxville, there's Harriman, Tennessee, a small town, and we stay there several times because it's sort of a good place to stop for the night. And somehow I had forgotten, even though Bing Crosby talks about this in his autobiography, Call Me Lucky, and of course it's mentioned in pretty much every biography of Bing Crosby, that Dixie Lee is from Harriman, Tennessee. Could you tell us a little bit about Harriman for those listeners who may have no idea where that is located?
Yeah, Harriman is in eastern Tennessee, and it's kind of close to the. I guess you consider it between the Tennessee Valley region and the Cumberland Plateau region. So it kind of falls in between there. It's a small little historic city. It's actually a city. It was incorporated in 1891, and it was named for Walter Harriman, who was a Civil War officer who had camped nearby the Emery River there during the Civil War, and that's kind of how it got its name. And it's got the nickname known as the town that Temperance built. So when it was created, it was kind of envisioned as a town free of alcohol, debauchery, and all that stuff. So it was meant to, I guess you could almost think of it as like a moral compass in a way,
Mm-hmm.
for or maybe not necessarily a utopia per se, but a city that's free of bad things. And it's situated in Roane County, which is here in East Tennessee. And it's about, I guess it's probably about a 35 minute drive from Knoxville, so it's not too far from Knoxville.
Well, I suppose that even though she is quite forgotten these days, Dixie Lee was probably one of the most famous people to come out of that small town of Harriman, Tennessee. And the excuse to actually be talking to you today on the show is the fact that the city of Harriman, Tennessee is honoring her, Dixie Lee, with a plaque, historical marker, and you have been working hard at making this happen. Could you tell us a little bit about how all of this came to be, why and how, and when all of this started? And we're very happy to hear that she is going to be honored, but we'd like to know a little bit more about how all of this came about.
Yeah, so, well, it all started back when I started researching her, and it really, it's all this kind of started for me as kind of like a hobby, and I'm just a fan. I don't really, I mean, there's a possibility on my mother's side that I may have a common ancestor with her way back, but it would be very distant at best. So it was more of an approach that as a fan, and once I started reading about her, what little there was out there, and learned more about her career, that just kind of got me going on this. And then I started collecting artifacts. So I'd start getting, old movie stills, photos, stuff like that. Anything I could come across and get my hands on. And I've actually compiled a nice little small collection. One of the coolest things I have is I actually have the engraved. I don't know if it's full silver plated or whatever, but it's the engraved high chair, the table part, the tray part that was Gary's, that Bing and Dixie had made for Gary when he was a baby, and it's engraved Gary Evan Crosby on the top of it. And I purchased that from a guy out in California whose wife's grandmother or great grandmother, I don't recall what she said, but she was one of the maids for the Crosbys, and that's how she got it. So that's probably one of the most unique and coolest things I got. But it's just kind of cool to have something that that Dixie and Bing, specifically had made for their first child, and just to actually have that, hold that, have something that she probably held multiple times, and used, and it's just really neat. So that kind of snowballed into, okay, I'm a fan. I'm researching here about her. Why has she been forgotten, and what can I do to help change that? And so that led me to reach out to the city of Harriman and kind of pitch the idea to them. Say, hey, look, Dixie Lee can be. I'm not saying she was as popular as Dolly Parton, but she can kind of be for Harriman what Dolly Parton is for Sevierville.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that famous figurehead, and she was beautiful, talented. She had a little bit of sass to her, which was very that's very East Tennessean. So you know, and I love that about her, and you know, a wonderful singer, and so it kind of started there, and I got in touch with a gentleman named Blake Kirkland, who is a gentleman from Harriman, and you know, he would really I really owe a lot of credit and gratitude to him, because back in 2014 he led efforts to kind of do a little something for Dixie and Harriman, and he commissioned a portrait of her that is currently hanging in the Princess Theater, Harriman's historic movie theater. And so if it hadn't have been for Blake, you know, he kind of got the ball rolling here locally, and you know, I reached out to him, and I've since become real good friends with him, and you know, so I just got to talking to him and stuff, and I got to thinking, I'm like, well, how can I add to this? Because at the end of the day, it's not about me. It's not about notoriety. Not about recognition. I could care less. You could take my name off everything. You could take my name off, have anything to do with the historical marker. You could take it off this podcast. I don't care, as long as the whole purpose of this is to honor and recognize Dixie for who she was as a person, and her talent as an actress and singer in her career. So that's kind of where it started for me. It started as kind of like a hobby, and just, you know, researching, collecting, and then, you know, meeting some people in Harriman, talking to a few people around town in Harriman, then reaching out to the city, and in doing so, I was able to touch base with some of Dixie's family, and I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Dixie Lee Crosby, her granddaughter, who was, I mean, she had just as much involvement in this historical marker as I did. So, and it was really cool too to actually work with Dixie's granddaughter, who actually was named after her, to work together on this project to honor her. And that was really, that right there, you know, that's something I'll remember the rest of my life. That's just, to me, that's sentimental and something really special. And Dixie, the granddaughter, she is just a wonderful person, lovely woman, and you know, I'm very happy that we were able to kind of put this together. So the marker that's going to be going up in Harriman is actually through the Tennessee Historical Commission. They have a historical marker program, and it honors significant people, places, events, buildings that are important and contribute to the greater broad pattern of Tennessee history. And not anyone can get one of these markers. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to put one of these up. You actually have to apply for it. And the Tennessee Historical Commission, they meet 3 times a year, and they vote on new marker proposals. Now, the board, their committees that, you know, select these markers are, I mean, these are historians. I mean, these people are specialists. They know their stuff. So you can't just write up something and say, oh, I want to make a marker. You have to back it up with fact. And you have to submit documentation of the evidence and the facts. So it started out with a conversation with Dixie and like, hey, you know, what do you think about this idea? I don't, you know, and we had a general idea of where the house stood that Dixie was born in. It is no longer there. It burned in a house fire in 1959. But basically it was kind of like a shotgun style wood frame house, 1 story, and it was in the Walnut Hill section, or Walnut Hill neighborhood of downtown Harriman, which is one of the older parts of the town. And the house itself was actually owned by Dixie's grandfather, James Scarborough. So that was Nora Scarborough's father. So, and how Dixie was born there is kind of an interesting thing in and of itself. Now, based on my research, I believe that what had happened is that her father, Evan Wyatt, had actually gone out of town up north to see about a job, and during this time period, the Wyatts, which by the way, Dixie's, I guess I should mention that first. Dixie's birth name is Wilma Winifred Wyatt,
and she was known as Billy when she was a little girl.
Yes, Billy was her nickname, and the whole Dixie name came into play when she entered the singing contest in 1928. But I believe that Mr. Wyatt had gone out of town, and Nora was staying with her father, which would have made sense. Up until that point, city directory records and census records and all that stuff indicate that Mr. and Mrs. Wyatt, Dixie's parents, had rented. They didn't really have a lot of money. And, of course, Evan Wyatt, he was in the military. He was actually a musician in the Army. And her grandfather, his dad, Jim Wyatt, he was actually a singing teacher in East Tennessee. So he taught singing school. So music was in her blood. So it's no wonder that she was so good at it. But I believe that Mr. Wyatt went out of town looking for a job, and Nora was staying with her father in Harriman and went into labor, and Dixie was born. While Mr. Wyatt was, I believe he was out of town. I don't think that he was there present at the birth. I haven't 100% confirmed that, but I do know around that time period he was going up north to check on a job. And then in 1910, the 1910 census, the family is up in Connellsville, Pennsylvania. So that supports, him going up north for a position.
Now, I've read in several places that she actually lived in several different cities growing up, like Memphis and New Orleans and even Chicago. Could you explain a little bit about why and how and when they left the East Tennessee area?
Well, they were in the Wyatt family and the Scarborough family. They have long and deep ties to East Tennessee. It wouldn't be crazy to say that, those families were probably amongst some of the first families to settle East Tennessee or to move over whenever it formally became a state, like the late 1700s, early 1800s. So they've been in the area, for quite some time. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, there's a part of Oak Ridge that actually used to be named Scarborough. And that was a community, and some of her family is from that area. She actually has some, I think, grandparents or great-grandparents that are buried on some of the federal property there. So, but basically they were kind of from the East Tennessee area, and before Dixie was born, Evan and Nora spent a lot of time in Knoxville. They lived in Knoxville. Matter of fact, Evan was a motor coachman for one of the motor coaches for Knoxville Transit Company, and he worked different jobs. And I was able to learn this through city directories and census records and such. But they would bounce around and rent. So basically, if you look at the timeline, that they're kind of in the Knoxville area from, probably, I say, let me pull up my notes here and I can give you the exact date. In the 1900 census, Evans in Roane County, and then 1904, you see him and Nora show up in Knoxville, and they were actually renting, kind of in that area. One of the areas they rented in was the Lonsdale area. They were married. They were actually married in Roane County in 1905. So they got married in Roane County, and then they're in Knoxville pretty much, from 1905 all the way up through 1909, 1910. They briefly went up north to Pennsylvania, and then they came back to Knoxville and stayed through about 1913. So they started out kind of going between Roane County and Knox County, and then Evan eventually got a job with an insurance company, and that required him to move quite a bit too. And then from Knoxville, they go to Memphis. They're in Memphis for a little bit. They actually lived a year in Greenville, Mississippi, and then they went to New Orleans, and then from New Orleans to Chicago. So they did bounce around quite a bit, and it's interesting when you think about that, because if you think about the culture in East Tennessee with our musical heritage here, but then you look at Memphis, and then you look at New Orleans, you can see, and then you look at Dixie's style, the way she sang, you can see where she probably got some influence from some of these areas.
Mm-hmm.
And she was also a huge fan of Ella Fitzgerald, the jazz singer. And I'd read, and I don't recall off the top of my head where I read it, but they said she rarely missed one of her performances. This was later on after her and Bing were married. But she was a huge fan. I believe one of the boys even said she used to go around the house humming and singing a Tisket a Tasket.
That's right.
So I think Dixie was a huge fan of that soul type blues jazz, because if you think about where she was living, I mean, Memphis and New Orleans, you're right there in the heart of it, so I think that had a great influence on. Then if you look at East Tennessee, the Appalachian style of music and some of the gospel singing and stuff like that, it's kind of looking at all that from the outside, you can kind of see where maybe she got some of her style, So yeah, they definitely bounced around, but they spent a good deal of time in East Tennessee, and many of her cousins, aunts, and uncles and stuff stayed in East Tennessee, and most of the people in East Tennessee that claim, that are descended from her are, descended from these aunts and uncles and cousins and such, because she did have two older sisters, but they, Neva and Ida, but they died pretty young. Neva was 17 when she died, and Ida was 12. So, she didn't have any direct nieces and nephews from her siblings.
Many sources give us the birth date of 1911, but the other day when you and I were talking on the phone, you told me that there is evidence that perhaps she was born in 1909.
Oh, yeah, there is very strong evidence to suggest that she was born in 1909. For starters, you look at the census records, and the first piece of evidence is the 1910 census. The family is living in Connellsville, Pennsylvania, and there is a baby. It doesn't say Wilma, but it says baby Wyatt. That's a daughter born in Tennessee, and I think it said like 5 or 6 months old at the time that the census was taken. So that right there, if she was born in 1911, she couldn't have been on the 1910 census. And there's no other evidence, and I've yet to find any other evidence that there was a fourth child. So that's the first piece of evidence that I would present, as evidence that she was born in 1909. In 1920, she's listed as being 10 years old on this census, and that census was actually recorded on January 2nd, 1920. So that means her birthday was on November 4th, 1920 that year, so she would have turned 11 years old. So in the 1920 census, she's listed as 10 because she hadn't turned 11 yet, mm-hmm. And that points to the 1909. There's also a few newspaper articles out there that list her birth year as 1909. The Mount Carmel item published July 2nd, 1929, specifically lists the November 4th, 1909. And then the article that was released in 1959 after she had passed and when her house burned mentioned that she was born in 1909. And it's important, I haven't been able to find any type of formal birth certificate. Birth records were not consistent around that time period. I believe the birth records they actually started keeping birth records like either from 1906 or 1908 forward, but they weren't always consistently kept in the more rural areas. And given the fact that this family moves so much, it's quite possible that there isn't a formal birth certificate. It could, the only record that could have been would be the family Bible, and I don't know of the family Bible or if it's survived or if there was one or whatnot. But it's kind of hard to find an actual birth certificate for her. And another piece of evidence that I came across in my research is she gave her first public performance on May 1st, 1928, for the Rotary Club of Chicago. And this was a luncheon that was at the Sherman Hotel. Now, this is what's interesting in it. I've actually read and looked at the flyer for that program that was actually hers. It was from her personal records. And she was billed as Dixie Carroll, and the story behind that is when she entered that singing contest, and she even said this in a newspaper article interview, she told them her name was Dixie Carroll, that way if she lost, the kids wouldn't know it was her, which I thought was hilarious. but and it's actually pretty smart, too, so she just kind of went with Dixie Carroll, and in the caption it says, and I'll read you the caption here, it says, Dixie Carroll, the beautiful 18-year-old Senn High School winner of the All-Chicago Amateur Song Contest against 300 competitors. By special courtesy of Frank Baring, she appears before us previous to her first public appearance as a star in the College Inn next Monday night. So what's interesting about that is that program is dated May 1st, 1928. It says she's 18 years old. So if you do the math, that puts it at 1910. So she wouldn't have celebrated her 19th birthday until November 4th, 1928, that same year. Mm-hmm. So that supports the 1909 birth date as well. And there's also a newspaper article. I don't have a date on it, but it's from New Orleans. I've seen it. And it actually talks about how she would have graduated from Sophie B. Wright's school, and I'm going to pull it up here, and I'll actually read you the article if you don't mind. Let me get it here. It's okay. Here we go. It's the title of the article is Miss Wilma Wyatt is Voice Contest winner. So this is an article that came out of New Orleans, and the article doesn't have a date on it because I'm looking at an actual physical clipped article. But based on what they're saying in the article, you can pretty much reason that it was published in May 1928. Miss Wilma Wyatt, known as Billy, and this is the interesting part, it says, who would have been graduated from Sophie B. Wright High School last week if she had remained in New Orleans, has won through her voice the title of Best Entertainer in the Marion Tally contest held in Chicago. The honor carries with it a 4-week engagement at the College Inn of the Sherman Hotel in Chicago at $100 a week. On the strength of her winning first place, Miss Wyatt received 4 professional offers, but her parents would not permit her to assent as this would require her leaving home. Now, I'm going to come back to that, and I think that's an interesting statement too, and I'll come back to that here in just a moment. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. E. Wyatt, lived in New Orleans at 4114 Prytania Street. And by the way, that apartment building, if you look that up, 4114 Prytania Street, that's still standing. It's really interesting. You can actually see some pictures of it. Miss Wyatt entered the contest under the name of Dixie Carroll, but announced her real name after winning the prize. Now, the reason this article is important is because it tells us 2 things. Number one, it says who would have been graduated from Sophie B. Wright School last week. Most students graduate from high school at age 18. So that supports the 1909 date. Also, this is what was real telling to me. And I didn't think about this until after the fact. Her granddaughter, Dixie, had told me, because we were talking about, why change the year? Why 2 years? Why would you do that? And Dixie Lee Crosby, her granddaughter, told me, she said, knowing my grandpa Wyatt, it sounds like something that Hillman and the family would have done to protect her, because if they made her younger, then that meant that the parents had some say in her business dealings and the contract and such. So that could have been done to protect her. And it's not really far-fetched when you think about it, because they lost their other two daughters. Dixie was their only surviving child at that point. She also happens to be the baby. We know that this family struggled financially. So if this could be a huge deal, not just for Dixie, but for the family. So by them saying that she's a minor, that gives them a little leverage in negotiations and in approving things as well. Because it says right here in the article, she had 4 professional offers, but her parents would not permit her to assent, as this would require her leaving home. And we know that later on that her mother, Nora, went with her as chaperone when she ultimately did go out and perform. She got the Good News. She worked on the Good News play, and then ultimately Fox. So Dixie Lee, her granddaughter, she thinks that the family changed the birth year early on as a means of protecting her, but also to give them a little more control in negotiations with contracts and such. And I think that that's a very, very, very good theory. And, it wouldn't surprise me. I don't think we'll ever know 100% how or why it got changed, but I think that that's a very solid theory on that. The only other thing that I can think of, the only other motivation behind changing it could have been Fox Films' move, because back then the studio system, as you know, they had a lot of control over their stars, especially the women. The women weren't treated as fairly as the men. They weren't treated. They could tell a woman what to look like, how much she could weigh. They changed her name. They changed her name. They changed it. The reason she changed her name, it was changed to Dixie Lee, was because Fox said, hey, we already got too many Carols. We got Sue Carroll and Nancy Carroll. And so they changed it to Dixie Lee. And by the way, on a side note, Sue Carroll and Dixie were actually really close friends. So I found that to be interesting as well. So, back then they could even tell them who to date and who to marry. They tried to tell her. I mean, Fox tried to tell her not to marry Bing, and she did. Anyway, so that's one thing I respect about her is she was her own person. She didn't let them just tell her what to do and rule her life. Now that's one thing I like about it. And as far as her walking away from Hollywood, it's almost like I felt like she did it on her own terms, and it wasn't necessarily forced. But that's up for that's just pure speculation. I have no evidence or anything to support that. It's just me just kind of thinking. But yeah, so it's really interesting, how all that came about. And one other thing I'd like to add that supports the 1909 date, in 1930, she wrote a letter. It was like a biography interview to the Knoxville News Sentinel, which is the local paper here. Now, it states in that now you got to keep in mind this is in 1930. She said that she was born in 1911. However, she also says that I'm quoting her here, until I was 4, I lived in Knoxville. We then moved to Memphis, where I lived until I was 11 years old. Now, that was interesting to me, and that led me to really start digging into the city directories and following Evan Wyatt's movements. Okay, so he was listed in the Knoxville City Directory from 1909 to 1913. That's 4 years. So that matches up perfectly with her saying that until I was 4, I lived in Knoxville. And then she also stated that we then moved to Memphis, where I lived until I was 11 years old. Well, when you look at the city directories there, the city directories put Evan Wyatt in Memphis from 1914 to 1920. So 6 years, and that puts her right at 11 years old, around that mark. So because 1921 they moved to Greenville, Mississippi. So that all that adds up. So when you look at all this, if you looked at one thing, isolated, you could probably find a way to say, well, maybe that was a mistake, or maybe this was that. But when you look at all this together, I think it's pretty clear that she was born in 1909.
You're listening to the first episode of Say Don't You Remember, and we're talking to Chris Hammond, a school teacher in East Tennessee, who has been digging real deep into the life and career of Dixie Lee Crosby. My name is Anton Garcia-Fernandez, and you're listening to this episode on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. Now, Chris, if she was born in 1909, and you make a really strong case for that, she would be about 6 years younger than Bing Crosby. And by the time they met in Hollywood and they got married, she was actually more popular or better known than Bing himself. Let's talk briefly about how she got into show business. We know that she won that singing contest, and I think the great singing star of the era, Ruth Etting, was part of the jury, and her singing style in many ways reminds me a little bit of Ruth Etting's singing style as well. You mentioned all the blues and jazz and Ella Fitzgerald influence. I feel like Ruth Etting also features prominently in her way of singing, at least from the recordings that I've been able to hear, the ones that she made. How did Dixie Lee, after winning that singing contest, get into show business, relocate to Hollywood, and met Harry Lillis, Bing Crosby?
Yeah, so, I think you make a great point. I definitely 110% agree with you. I think Ruth Etting definitely influenced her style. As a matter of fact, I think Dixie might have been emulating, or kind of copying her style a little bit. Because if you listen to Ruth Etting and then you listen to Dixie, you're like, wow, because it's just their styles are very, very similar. And a matter of fact, Ruth Etting actually helped Dixie with her first contract. She loaned her, helped her with arrangements. She loaned her a pianist, and helped her out. So I think, this is just me thinking. I don't have any evidence of this. This is just speculation. But to me, it seems like Ruth Etting saw a little bit of herself in her,
mm-hmm.
and she kind of wanted to help her out. And I think Ruth Etting definitely helped get that career started, and helped her get on her way. So she wins the contest there in Chicago, and she ends up getting I think it's a 6-week contract with the college in there. She starts there, and while she was there, she was offered a part in the Good News play, which was then in Philadelphia. So, what's interesting is in an article or interview done by Earl Wilson that was published in 1947. He interviewed Dixie, and she was talking about how she couldn't dance, so she. Too, which if you've seen her number at the beginning of Happy Days, the Crazy Feet number, she's a great dancer. She's a natural. She was very quick learner. That much is obvious. So I do want to read you this quote from this article because I think you'll enjoy this, and I think your listeners will too. So this is about the actual contest. So this is Dixie talking here. I was in school in Chicago and wanted to quit, so I took singing lessons. One day, Daddy brought in a paper and said, "There's an amateur contest tonight, and you're in it." My name was Billy Wyatt, but I changed it so all the kids wouldn't know it was me if I lost. Ruth Etting, a judge, voted for me. I was so lousy and nervous, I guess she knew I was the only real amateur in the amateur contest. I love her sense of humor. Like, she's not afraid to, crack jokes and stuff like that. And that's what makes her even more charming. She's got that Southern charm about her. So she gets this play in Good News, or this part in Good News, and she ends up ultimately going on Broadway. And she had filled in. I believe she had filled in for someone in there in the play that had gotten sick or something like that. And that's when Fox studio exec spotted her, and then that's when they offered her I believe it was a 3-year contract, and that's when they went out to Hollywood, and she There's one short film out there. Now I haven't found any evidence of it surviving or anything, but there's one short film that she's credited with on IMDb, and IMDb can be edited by users, so it could be incorrect. But there's one short film out there called Nights Out that has the date of 1929. But she definitely makes her a strong debut in 1929 as she's in the Fox movie Tone Follies. Mm-hmm. Why Leave Home, and then in Happy Days, and that's the one where she did the Crazy Feet numbers. So she hits the ground running in 1929 and just takes off. And then she does a few films in 1930. 1929 through 1931, that's her busiest time as an actress. Some of her roles were more supporting roles. A few of them were just small parts, like a secretary. She was a secretary in the 1931 film Quick Millions. I actually discovered quite by accident. I found a photo of the seller on eBay had listed it as Anita Page. And I was just flipping through, and sometimes I look for old photos and stuff. And I thought I glimpsed Dixie in this photo. So I go back and I look at it, and it's two women kind of laying on a bed talking. And sure enough, Dixie's on the left. And I get to looking at this picture, and I'm like, what movie is this from? And so I had to do a lot of digging, but I come to find out it was from the 1931 film Young Sinners. And Dixie was in that movie just in a very, very small part. So that was a new one that I didn't even know about. And so it's quite possible that, I do know that she's been in at least 17 films. Possibly more, and it's really hard to tell because a lot of Fox Films' original negatives and prints were destroyed in the Vault Fire of 1937. So, unfortunately, several of the films she's in are currently considered lost. But it doesn't mean that there's not prints out there. I'll give you an example. In 1930, she starred with Sue Carroll in The Big Party. That was a Fox film. Now that movie's considered lost, and you can find lobby cards and pictures out there and stuff. But earlier this year, I found 2 of the 7, like the big Vitaphone 16-inch disc soundtracks from that film, and from an antique dealer, and I bought them. And a good friend of mine, Bradley Reeves, he spearheads Appalachian Media Archives here locally. He does excellent archival work with film and music and local history. He's also a part-time radio DJ, so he's just an excellent, when it comes to East Tennessee movie, music, and history, this guy, he's on top of his game. He's actually in the process, today, he's going to digitize those, and the plan is to send the original discs, because they're so rare. I'm looking at donating those to UCLA Film Archives, just so they can be protected in the event that any of other parts of the film are found, either an actual film print or to clarify. Like I said, this is not the film. This is just it's probably about 10 minutes of audio from the film on each disc. So that's an example. A lot of those films got lost. And now there may still be some out there, so check your attic and your basement. You never know. But yeah, so she was pretty busy there from 1929 through 1931, and you add on top of that, she gets married to Bing in 1930.
Yes, and that's precisely something that I wanted to follow up on, because it is around that time, late 20s, 1929, that she meets and falls in love with Bing Crosby. Bing Crosby at that time was not a movie star. He was a singing, sort of like a singing star at that point already, with the Paul Whiteman Orchestra, which was one of the most important orchestras at the time. He was a part of the Rhythm Boys with Al Rinker and Harry Barris. And when they meet, it's around the end of Bing's tenure with the band as part of the Rhythm Boys, and also he made some solo vocal recordings with the band. Let's talk a little bit about how Bing and Dixie meet, and also let's reinforce this idea that at that point she was a much better known star than Bing Crosby was.
Yeah, actually, and before we get into the Bing part, I'd like to add there were rumors circulating in the summer of 1929. Now, this is before she met Bing, that she was going to marry her co-star from the film Why Leave Home, David Rawlins. And there's actual I actually have the article. It says Southern Girl Too Clever for News Gatherers, and it's from the Morning Call out of Laurel, Mississippi. And it's talking about Dixie Lee, I'll just read you a little bit of it. It says, although Dixie Lee, said to be the original varsity drag girl, was born in Tennessee and the family home is in New Orleans, she seems to have quite a Yankee strain in her. When you ask her a question, she asks you another by way of reply. For instance, is it true you and David Rawlins are going to be married? Have you asked my mother? She replied. Where's your mother? What did Davy say? Dixie countered. So, I love that. These interviews give you a real sneak peek into her personality. Like, she just had this. You could tell she had a real good sense of humor and this little bit of sassiness. So it's easy to see how Bing would have been attracted to her. David, a lot of men would have been attracted to her. So I don't know what happened. Now, I haven't found a ton of evidence, or on the whole David Rawlins things. But apparently, there's a few articles that suggest that they were a couple at some point there in 1929. Now, as far as her meeting Bing, I've looked into that a little bit, and I read some of Bing biographies. I know there's multiple people that claim credit for introducing them, but I'm going to refer back to this article by Earl Wilson because it's really funny what she says in here. And if you don't mind me, if you can, tolerate me reading a few more clips here, tidbits from it.
Oh, that's fine. Please go ahead.
This is from Earl Wilson in 1947. So, let's see here. She lived with Peggy, I think you pronounce that Rainier, and Holly Hall, both of whom had dates with Bing and were crazy about him. Now, this is Dixie talking here. I took such a fry at him because he always broke dates with them. I just wanted to meet this character once and tell him off. He called once and wanted to meet me. I said, you tell that guy I'm not in the habit of going places to meet anybody, especially him. Later, when they had a date, she found he was spoiled even then. He wore +4s and yellow socks and hoped he'd get a break in pictures. He was a lousy dancer. He said, you know my phone number, call me up. And this is Dixie talking. Her reply says, I said, I've news for you. I never call anybody up. Then she goes on to say, I'm 35 years old, she said, and I've yet to call him up. I'm still that bratty. So, of course, they were married. And then she goes to praise him. She says, Bing is so charming, she said. He spoiled me so much I can't stand being around other people. And everything he's done on his own. He's the hardest working guy in the world. I think that I think it's kind of cute how they, how first it was he was like having to chase her and stuff, and she was wanting to tell him off and all that. Now this is per her interview with Earl Wilson, and I know there's probably some different reports out there and stuff, but I just find that really interesting. But and I do recall, and I'm sure you and all your listeners and the readers of Bing Magazine and all that are very familiar with whenever they got married. The Associated Press called him Murray Crosby because he wasn't as well known. So she was more well known than him at that time. Her career was really going up, and she met him. They got married. His career starts to take off, and then she walks away from it to be a wife and a mother, and I think that's equal. I think it's very respectable. I think that moms and wives are some of the unsung heroes of our country, and so and then the rest is history. They have their boys, and Bing pretty much essentially becomes, I guess you could qualify him as the first real big celebrity, or kind of like that kind of crossed over. When you look at music and in film and stuff, the way he did, the way he promoted himself and his brand, I mean, the guy was a pioneer. He paved the way. There wouldn't be Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley, and leading on up to celebrities we have today without Bing Crosby.
Absolutely, and if since you bring that up, what's really interesting is that if you think, for example, of the amount of songs that Elvis Presley recorded that were actually first sung by Bing Crosby, there's a whole bunch of songs that Elvis did that were associated with Crosby before, and of course they were not rock and roll songs. Same thing with Sinatra, and that the first album that Sinatra recorded for Columbia Records, called simply "The Voice," features Sinatra's own versions of songs that had been introduced or hits for Bing Crosby. Many of them, like "Paradise" or "Ghost of a Chance," that there are on that first Sinatra album, were originally hits for Bing, songs clearly associated with him. So definitely, Bing Crosby was a pioneer in many different fields, not just music, but as you mentioned, he crossed over to many other media, and he became a really shrewd businessman. There's many things that Bing Crosby did that sometimes go unnoticed. The invention of recording tape, for example, was funded by Bing Crosby, mostly because he loved to golf and he wanted to have more of a chance to record his radio shows instead of doing them live, so that he could spend more time on the links. As one among many other reasons, and yeah, he was a very important businessman. He knew he was really intelligent about investing and about endorsing products and things like that. Things that later Elvis did, that the Beatles did. He was doing already in the 1930s and 1940s. Not to mention how huge of a singing star on radio he was and how important he was during the World War II years. But what's interesting, Chris, is that when Bing Crosby met Dixie in the late 20s and early 30s, and he still had not gotten his singing career off the ground, although he was singing with one of the most important bands in the country and in the world at that point, which was the Paul Wyman Orchestra, his lifestyle was completely different from the lifestyle he would adopt later on. And he was drinking and carousing, and he was not taking things seriously. That changed, actually, it seems, after he met Dixie Lee. Not right away, because this is something else that maybe we could talk about. Their relationship was viewed by the press as, incredibly idyllic, and they were the perfect Hollywood couple, were seen at parties and places and things like that. But they actually did run into lots of problems in their marriage, even early on. And they were briefly separated. It looked like Dixie Lee wanted to divorce Bing early on. Then it didn't happen. She was instrumental in keeping his head cool, in his kicking the drinking habit that he had. And unfortunately, she did acquire that habit herself. Would you have you done some research into the relationship, into the marriage of Bing Crosby and Dixie Lee, into the dynamics between the two?
Yeah, in my research, I've come across multiple articles. I've watched some documentaries and stuff, and as far as their marriage goes, I think it's pretty well known and accepted. That Bing was a little rowdy at first when they met, and that's not. I'm not saying to put him down, or anything like that, but Dixie kind of helped put her foot down and helped him kick some of those wilder ways, and then she struggled. She had her struggles with alcohol as well. I don't think anybody would really dispute that. But as far as what went on in their marriage, my thing with that is, and my approach to that is, I wasn't in that marriage. I don't know what happened, and of course Hollywood. You look at tabloids now. I mean, they paint a picture, and really to be fair, people in general, fans in general, when we think of our favorite celebrities and stuff, we have these pictures in our mind of them, and that they're these perfect people and all this, and I think people lose sight that they're people. You know, that they have struggles, they have issues just like anybody else, and you know, I do remember reading that when Dixie, early in their marriage, when Dixie had threatened to leave him, he had wooed her back by singing "I Surrender, Dear." So, which that sounds very, you know, very likely. You know, I'm sure that did happen. But you know, as far as that goes, that's one of the things that's motivated me so much to help give Dixie the recognition that she deserves, because I feel like she's kind of gotten an unfair shake on that part. And what I mean by that is, and I mean, I don't mean this in any disrespectful way to Bing or Bing's fans or any of the Crosby family or anything, but it's, you know, now it's just been like Dixie Lee. Well, she was Bing Crosby's first wife, the mother of his children. Oh, and she was an alcoholic. And that's all that's really said. And there's been some articles and some programs out there that's kind of thrown her under the bus a little bit, and I don't think that's fair. And it's also created this this kind of myth that, you know, alcohol killed her, and that's not accurate, because there's sufficient evidence that ovarian cancer is what killed her, and that's genetic. There's no relationship between alcohol consumption and ovarian cancer. And I think, you know, people like to point out, critics are quick to point out that, you know, Dixie, she got Bing to stop, but she had her own drinking problems. But there's a few things that I don't think people take into context here and look at. Number one, you have to understand that look at Dixie's childhood, and that's the big focus that I'm looking at her early life and her career. Look at her childhood. They moved around a lot. She suffered from stage fright, which is incredible, because when you watch her performances, you can't tell. Mm-hmm. She's fantastic. I'll point to Love and Bloom in 1935, her film with George Burns and Gracie Allen. She is phenomenal, and she lights up the screen. You cannot tell that woman had stage fright. She had stage fright. I'm sure there was anxiety there, and you also got to look at the fact that she lost both of her siblings while she was, you know, going into her teenage years. Mm-hmm. I don't care. That's traumatic. I mean, because I don't know about anyone else, but with my siblings, you know, I have an older brother and an older sister, and, you know, I grew up and I did stuff with them, and they played with me when I was younger and stuff like that. So it's, you know, that right there takes a toll on somebody. So I'm sure that scarred her emotionally, and the family, you know, they didn't have a lot of money, so I'm sure she saw some hard times. And I'm not. Listen, I'm not saying that she, you know, that gives her anyone a license to drink alcohol or anything. But, you know, at the end of the day, you know, I think that narrative that she was just this alcoholic and that's it, it's totally unfair. And with the ovarian cancer, she started having serious health issues around 1945. She actually had a critical case of pneumonia too. You know, that back then, you're talking about right out of World War II, chemotherapy and cancer treatments were very primitive. They weren't nothing near what we got today. And, you know, I can also imagine that she was probably in a lot of pain. So the drinking, and back then, alcohol was prescribed for medicinal purposes, even to pregnant women. So, you know, because they didn't know things, you know, the full effects of it until much later on. So, you know, I do think she struggled with it, but I think it's unfair. And I'm not saying you're saying this. I just think it's unfair the way she's been portrayed in the past, as like that defined her. Like that's all that she was she was just the wife to Bing Crosby, mother of his child, and an alcoholic. And the irony was she got Bing to stop, but then she struggled with it herself. I think you got to look at the complete picture.
Absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with that. And latching on to what you say about that, I think that portraying her in that way as an alcoholic and that's it is as unfair as the portrayal of Bing Crosby that has been put out by several people as him being a child beater and a wife beater and that sort of thing. And unfortunately, when you spread those rumors that have no basis in reality, they're really hard to do away with. And I think that has happened to Bing, and that has tarnished the image of Bing. And what you're talking about has tarnished her image as well. Now, what I would like to say, since you were mentioning this, I would like to turn to Bing's autobiography briefly, and I'm not sure if you've read it or not, but you may have. Uh, it's the autobiography that Bing Crosby wrote in the early 1950s with Pete Martin. Are you familiar with that book?
Yes, I am. I am familiar with it. I don't have it in front of me, but I have most of his biographies. I have copies of them, and I've went through different parts, but I have most of them. But I am familiar with that.
Well, if you don't have it in front of you, but I do, and this is an as told to sort of biography. Bing didn't write it, but Pete Martin did. Conducted tons of interviews with Bing, and he does a great job at actually keeping or portraying the actual spirit of Bing's personality and way of talking in such a way that it really does look like Bing wrote the biography. And when discussing Dixie, and he does quite a bit in this book from the early 1950s, he only has nice things to say about Dixie Lee. Of course, she had just passed away when he wrote and published this book. But he talks about things like the fact that she was like a rock to him, his best and most honest fan and critic, the fact that she kept him from becoming too self-important, too self-involved due to his huge success. He talks about the fact that she was a wonderful mother, that she was a marvelous wife in every way. He says that he's going to miss her greatly after the passing. And to such an extent that he doesn't really want to talk about that too much, but he does say certain things about her that I think are interesting, and I thought I would read a couple of those if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
He says at some point, when my name became better known, I could count on Dixie to keep my head from getting too big. Like any wise wife, whenever she thought my ego was getting out of hand, she had her methods for shrinking me to proper size. She'd say, listen to the romantic singer of the songs you love to hear blues. Or she'd call me the bumptious baritone or old gravel throat. Or when I tried ineffectually to lecture the kids, she'd say, you're fooling the people, but you can't fool them, eh? He's basically talking about how important she was to him personally, but also when it comes to keeping a hold of his career and of who he was in the face of this enormous success he had. I mean, you have to bear in mind that Bing Crosby in the 1940s, his radio show was heard by more than 50 million people every week. I mean, that's unheard of these days. And then later on, he also talks about a couple of things that are interesting, and I would like to ask you about one of those. If you go to page 47, the previous quote was from page 46. He says, although she was very frank and outspoken, she was also diffident and shy. She had little self-confidence. She never did think she was good in show business. I've known all of the others, and when it came to singing a song, Dixie had no equal, but it was a matter of life and death to persuade her to sing. And right before that, he says that what Dixie's studio and her fans didn't know when she left show business, that is, was that she didn't want to go big places. She didn't like show business and the hokum that goes with it and the necessity of being nice to people you don't enjoy being nice to. She never could bring herself to con people or butter them up the way a girl breaking into pictures is asked to do to advance herself. For this reason, and this is important, it was no sacrifice for her to leave show business. She had a very good agent who did a terrific job for her after she came to Hollywood, but she hated the things that he wanted her to do. As a part of pushing her career, he asked her to give out interviews or go to benefits or make radio broadcasts to exploit pictures. Then there was the business of being sweet to writers and producers and directors and other studio executives who, her instinct told her, didn't rate sweetness or even civility. She tried to do these things, but she died inside as she did them. So Bing is portraying her as somebody who had little self confidence, who was really self effacing, who didn't really want to go through the kinds of motions that you have to go through to become a huge film star. What do you think about that? Now that I'm reading this in the research that you've carried out, after she married Bing Crosby, she still made several movies. In fact, the one you mentioned, Love and Bloom, which is the only one that I have seen with her on it, from 1935 with Burns and Allen, it's a fantastic picture. I mean, nobody probably remembers it anymore, but I've seen it, and I think it's a really good picture and one that shows off her talent really well. Why do you think, Chris, that Dixie Lee Crosby, besides the fact that she married Bing Crosby and had 4 kids, why did she leave show business?
Well, first of all, I definitely, all that you read about Bing, that right there, to me, that just speaks to her authenticity. Mm-hmm. She's being herself, and I respect that. I respect that she's being who she is, and she didn't let Hollywood totally change her. And in a time where, I mean, look at what they, and I'm not trying to pick on Hollywood, but look at what happened to some of the famous stars back then. I mean, you had substance abuse, you had all kinds of stuff, and careers and lives were ruined, and that's a trend you can even see into Hollywood today, for people that couldn't handle it. And I admire her for being willing to be authentic and real with her and honest with herself and say, hey, this isn't for me. I personally, I think it's pretty well documented. I know Gary Giddens has touched on this, which, by the way, Gary Giddens, I've read his chapter on Dixie, and I've read some of his work on Bing. He's a phenomenal biographer. He got to. I'm actually a little jealous because he got to interview people that knew her firsthand. Back I believe in the late '90s, which was really really cool. That would have been something, So, but yeah, in his work, he's talked a little bit about this. I believe, she had stage fright, and you can even, and if you go back to that article that we were talking about earlier, where she's saying, I think confidence could have been an issue there. Now that's just my thoughts. I believe she was self-conscious, and she probably had anxiety. I don't know for a fact that she did, but it just, if you look at, the pattern there, she probably did, but I think ultimately, she was content with the quiet life. She was content with being a wife and mother, and I think that's very respectable. Bing. It's funny because when you hear Bing talk about Dixie, he gives her credit for helping him out. Being his rock. But then when you listen to Dixie talk about it, she doesn't. She's like, no, Bing did it all himself. So, and that right there shows me that they both kind of, were trying to lift each other up and support each other, and I think that's a integral part of any marriage, and so I think that I think she walked away because she was happy with what she had. I mean, if she wanted to, she could have even come back. And after she retired in 1935, she rarely made public appearances. Even with Bing, you just didn't see him out that much. But she did come back and she recorded "The Way You Look Tonight" and "A Fine Romance" with him, which are a lot of people. I think a lot of people forget that that's her singing with him, and that's the only two. To my knowledge, outside of a radio program, I think that's the only two pieces of professional work that they really did together.
And I wanted to actually, Chris, touch briefly upon those two. Those are two fantastic songs that were introduced, as many others, by Fred Astaire. Fred Astaire had a knack for introducing songs because the great songwriters of the era, the Gershwins and Cole Porter and Irving Berlin, and in fact, we're talking about Berlin in this case, I believe. They loved the voice of Fred Astaire and the way he delivered their songs, and so that's why he introduced so many of the great songs that now have been are known as standards. And these two were two songs that were originally introduced by Fred Astaire. One of them is A Fine Romance, one of those duet songs, one of the most popular duet songs of the era, as a matter of fact. Very funny with great lyrics, a great melody as well, and some opportunity for some banter back and forth. And then one of the classic American ballads of all time, "The Way You Look Tonight." And they recorded those two songs. And I would like to preface this part of our conversation with what Bing himself actually says about these recordings, also on "Call Me Lucky." Also, Gary Giddens talks about these two songs, and I think what he says is very interesting. In the first volume of the biography of Bing Crosby that he wrote, "A Pocket Full of Dreams," the early years 1903 to 1940, he does devote a whole page to discussing those two sides that they're recorded. But let's see what Bing has to say, and then I'll ask you what you think about those recordings, because I'm sure you've heard them. He says on page 47 of "Call Me Lucky," "She cut a couple of records with me, but no one will ever know the ordeal I went through persuading her to make those records. Building the pyramids would have been easier. She thought of scores of reasons why she didn't want to do them. All of them sprang from her shyness." So he goes back to this idea that she was very shy and diffident. "She was an only daughter. She had been very close to her parents, and they'd shelter her as much as possible. She wasn't really an only daughter, as you have mentioned, but but her siblings did pass away." And then it says, "As a result, she'd never been before the public much prior to leaving home, and she never got over disliking it. She went into show business because she'd won that contest in Chicago for which a chum of hers entered her name without telling her about it. She followed through with it so as not to let her chum down." So apparently Bing says that it fell on him to actually convince her to do these records. It doesn't come across that way to me on the recordings. I don't think that that Bing has the same kind of how should I say it, the same kind of relationship with Dixie Lee on these recordings as he had with Bob Hope or with some of the other great artists that he did duets with, like Rosemary Clooney or Louis Jordan or Connie Boswell. But they are charming records, and I think they do stand as a testament to their relationship, because they do seem sort of on the same wavelength when they sing these songs. Even though, of course, Bing's vocal range was completely different to that of Dixie's, and apparently Victor Young, who arranged the recordings, had to do a little juggling with the keys and stuff so that both of them felt at ease. What do you think about those two recordings, "Fine Romance" and "The Way You Look Tonight" by Dixie Lee and Bing Crosby?
Oh, I think that they're great, and as a matter of fact, the "Way You Look Tonight," the Bing and Dixie version of that is my favorite. Not just because it's Dixie, but I just think it sounds really natural, and you got a husband and wife, two people that loved each other singing this, and I think both of those recordings are great. I believe either someone told me, I don't recall exactly where I heard this, but it was suggested that Bing had to be a little more conservative in his singing with Dixie to make that work, which kind of that's probably that sounds probably about right. They probably had to kind of tweak it a little bit to make them both feel comfortable. But I think it just points back to her. I think stardom kind of came to her unexpectedly, and as it does, I'm sure, a lot of actors and actresses. But and her parents, being protective over her, it's like I said a little earlier. I think with her siblings dying, at such young ages, I mean, it's easy to understand that, why that they would be more protective over Dixie. But yeah, it's interesting that they didn't really ever appear in a movie together. That would have been something interesting to see. But that those, as far as those songs goes, those are all time American classics. I love them. I think that I love the A Fine Romance, the little banter back and forth. I think that's funny. So it just kind of mirrors, just what I'm sure most couples, go through. So, but definitely two all time greats.
Let's talk, Chris, as we're starting to wind down our conversation here on Say Don't You Remember. We're talking about Dixie Lee Crosby. There's two things I would like to talk to you about before we get to the end of this recording, of this broadcast. And one of them has to do with her final years. She retreated into this role as a mother and wife to Bing Crosby. Their marriage was presented most of the time as the perfect sort of Hollywood marriage. Of course, behind that or under that surface, things were not as perfect as one might think. They had their problems, their rocky moments, their ups and downs, just like pretty much any marriage, but not just like any marriage, because this was a very public and publicized marriage that lasted for over 20 years. Bing portrays her as the perfect wife, really good mother. Talks about how she loved listening to music, even to his own records, that she would very often play Bing Crosby records at home, or he would come back home to find her listening to some of his songs. She was, as I said before, one of his best and most honest critics. And of course, he was a constant presence in the household. She had a closed and pretty close group of friends. One of them, as you mentioned before, was Sue Carroll. What were Dixie's last few years like that led up to her passing? As you said, she had been suffering from ovarian cancer. Tell us a little bit about those later years of her life, if you have done some research on them.
Yeah, well, like I said, her health started declining in 1945, and she died November 1st, 1952. But if you look at any pictures of her in the late 40s, early 50s, you can see how she's aged. She ages dramatically. Like, you can tell that she just doesn't, especially up, in the 50s, she just doesn't look as healthy. And I think the combination with her, being shy and kind of keeping to herself and being the stay-at-home mother and having health issues, I think she almost kind of turns into kind of like a recluse in a way. She just kind of, I won't say a hermit, but she kind of likes, she just kind of stays in. She does go out and stuff, and there's I don't know if you're familiar with Rory Burke, but she actually recalls some specific memories of Dixie from childhood, and has talked about how she was very sweet to kids, and very affectionate, but she kind of kept to herself, and I have to think that a lot of that was due to her health. I don't know exactly when she was diagnosed with cancer, but ovarian cancer, today we can test for a gene, and it's called the BRCA gene, or BRCA gene. There's BRCA, BRCA1, and BRCA2, and back then they didn't have that technology. I do know that she had a abdominal surgery at one point, and my guess is that probably was in my background is in healthcare. I actually teach health sciences, but I think that that could have been exploratory in nature. So I think her last years she stayed in a lot. I don't think she did a whole lot. I do know that she defied doctor's orders when, right before she slipped in the coma and died. Bing had come back in, and she went out and met him at the airport. And not long, I believe it was the next day, she slipped into a coma and then she died. So, the cancer just wreaked havoc on her. And like I said, it's without being there, it's hard to say. All you can really do is kind of speculate and look at what evidence there is out there. But I would imagine she spent a lot of her last days and stuff kind of in bed around the house, having help. George, there was a woman named Georgie. I believe her last name was Hardwick, Georgie Hardwick. She was Dixie's assistant and secretary, really close to her. She helped her out quite a bit. You gotta think, because Bing was still out making pictures and stuff. And to be fair to Bing, I think he probably would have stayed with Dixie, but I think Dixie was also probably the type to say, no, you go on and do that. Mm-hmm. She won't, because she, I think she was that type of person. She just seems like she always put her family first. And I could totally see her doing that. So, I can't imagine how hard it had to be for Bing too, out, still working and his wife going through all this.
Yeah, especially when he has to travel to France, for example, to make that movie Little Boy Lost. And of course she can't go with him, but she doesn't want to get in the way of his making the picture. And so really, in many ways, Bing wanted to stay with her, but she didn't want him to. And so Bing went out and did this work, whether it be pictures or radio or recordings. I think it's very telling what Bing says at the end of chapter number 16 of this autobiography, when he talks about the fact that he had lost Dixie Lee. Remember, this biography was published in 1953, so that was right after the passing of Dixie Lee. It has been reissued with a new introduction, precisely by Gary Giddens, back in 1992. And he says, pages 326, 327, I don't plan to talk about my grief at losing her. I believe that grief is the most private emotion a human being can have, and I'm going to keep mine that way. But in the years that lie ahead, I'm going to sorely miss her love, her steadfast and constructive support. She was the most completely honest person I've ever known, and as the last events in her life demonstrated, one of the most courageous. 2 weeks before her death, she took daily transfusions to build up her strength so she could come to the station and meet the train which brought me home. And she was there just as she'd always been, beautifully dressed, gay and smiling. I don't even want anything more in life than the memory of all she did for me. And it's hard to not feel tears welling up when he talks like that about the last and very difficult days that the two of them had to go through together. And this is why I feel it's so unfair, the way that Bing Crosby has been portrayed in relationship with Dixie, and also the way in which Dixie has been portrayed in her relationship with Bing, as you said before. And I'm hoping that our conversation and your research help people understand these two people and their relationship that they had together, and put it in context, because many times when we look at history, we want history to conform to our expectations and also to the values and to the ideology of the present time. And you have to put history into context. And I think that's something that you, Chris, are trying to do in your research about Dixie Lee. And in fact, I would like to end the conversation by asking you about this book that you're working on. If you would like to share something. You were telling me the other day that you are working on a book about Dixie Lee Crosby. What approach are you taking? Why are you doing this? Tell us a little bit about the book and what goal you would like to achieve with this book, please.
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, to follow up on what you said about Bing and Dixie both being portrayed, unfairly, I 100% agree with that. And just like I said earlier, that at the end of the day, we weren't in that marriage. We weren't there. They were, and they're human. And I don't know what all went on behind the scenes. It really doesn't matter what went on behind the scenes. And really, to be fair and to be frank, it's not anybody's business. That was their business. That was their marriage. Their business. And I think it's just I think it's disrespectful when media bloggers or whatever they speculate and they forget that these people are human too. So I definitely 110% agree with you on that. I think they both have been treated unfairly. As far as the book goes, it's something that's just kind of come about naturally. It's in its very, very early stages. I don't even know what this is going to look like when it's all said and done. But the goal to me is to focus on her early life and her career. I'm definitely not one that's going to be digging into speculation about the marriage and all that, because like I said, that's private. That was her Bing's business. That's nobody else's business. And for me, I want to really look at her early life, her family, her ties to East Tennessee. I want to look at who Dixie was as a person. And because when you look at all this, when you take all this stuff we've talked about today, you look at all of it collectively, it's a fascinating story. It's really a rags to riches kind of story, literally, because she went from being dirt poor, pretty much. Her family was poor, and she went on to be an actress on her own right, and then she risks all of that against the advice of many people, and marries Bing Crosby, and and then Bing Crosby reaches levels of superstardom that had never been attained before. And I think when you look back on it, even though I think both of them would be humble enough to where they want to give the credit to the other one, I think when you look at it, at the end of the day, without Dixie Lee, there's no Bing Crosby. Bing Crosby wouldn't have been as successful as he was. And on the same token, I think Bing was just as important to Dixie. And I think they worked well together. They really kind of held each other up. But the goal, the book, like I said, I don't have any time frame, publisher, or anything like that. It's just, like I said, it's just the very early stages. And this isn't something that, listen, I'm not trying to get my name out there or try to make any money or anything like that. I don't care about that. What I care about is honoring this woman and her legacy, and helping change the perspective of her, and bring her and introduce her to new generations, and just to recognize a local East Tennessean, because at the end of the day, she was one of us. And I'm going to read you a quote here that she said to Knoxville News Sentinel that is one of my favorite quotes. And this come directly from her. She said, "Someday I'm coming back to the beautiful hills and streams of Tennessee, which will always be home to me." Now we know that she didn't come back to Tennessee that often. She did come back when she was a child to visit an aunt and uncle briefly. I do know that her and Bing had plans to come back for Harriman's 50th anniversary, but they were unable to, I think, due to Bing's schedule. But for whatever reason, I don't know the full reasons why she wasn't able to make it back. But I do believe that you couldn't take that East Tennessee part out of her. I think that was part of her. And in this whole historical marker, she may not have been able to make it back physically, but getting this marker in her hometown and honoring her for who she was, in some ways, she is coming back to Tennessee. And And that's, at the end of the day, this whole project, I call it a project, the historical marker research, working on a book, all that stuff. At the end of the day, the goal is real simple for me. It is to honor this woman and introduce her to a wider audience and introduce her to a new generation. And just because of it's not because of necessarily all the big things she did, but even some of the little things. Giving it up, walking away from it, to be a mother and a wife. I think everybody out there, everybody listening, probably has some type of a mother figure in their life, or they've met someone that maybe has acted like a mother figure to them. Somebody that's been influential in their life, that was humble and that built them up and that encouraged them. And like I said, I believe moms are some of the unsung heroes out there, and I believe Dixie is an unsung hero. I think she definitely should be remembered for the person she was and the talent that she possessed, and not any character flaws or struggles she might have gone through, and not necessarily because of the disease that killed her. And that's another thing. I would love to see ovarian cancer awareness come from this. If nothing else, by learning about Dixie Lee, maybe it will encourage someone, especially women, to go get tested for this gene if cancer runs in their family, because early detection is key. So I think that's a proper way to honor her memory and her legacy by helping others. I think that's something that she would have liked.
And as Bing Crosby fans and people who are interested in anything and everything that has to do with Bing, and with Dixie Lee being such an important part of that history, of that saga of Bing Crosby, we really appreciate all the work you've done and all the work you keep doing and all of your research. Look forward to that book. And I just want to know if we already have a date for that ceremony, or, in honor of Dixie Lee in Harriman, Tennessee.
Well, first of all, thank you for the compliments, and thank you for having me as a guest on the podcast. As far as the date, we're still working on that. There will most likely be a formal press release from the city of Harriman once we get everything locked in. We're still kind of discussing some ideas and the date. We're looking at it. It would be towards the end of this year, towards the probably in the latter months there. Like I said, I don't want to give a specific date because I don't know a date yet, but there are a few that we're looking at. So, that's why in the press release, I believe that Harriman put out, they said we'd be releasing details at a later date. But as soon as that gets finalized, I guarantee I'll be the first one out there trying to spread it and get it out there, because I think it'll be a really neat event.
Well, we'll definitely keep an eye on that, and remember that I'm not that far away from Harriman, so if I can arrange it, I'd love to be present for that.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Well, Chris Hammond has been our guest. Thank you so much, Chris, for spending, about an hour and a half of this hot summer afternoon in East Tennessee. Well, I'm in West Tennessee, but anyway, close enough. Talking to us in this first episode of Say Don't You Remember? And we are remembering and honoring the memory of actress, singer, and also the wife of Bing Crosby, Dixie Lee Crosby. Thank you, Chris, and we'll definitely keep in touch.
Thank you.
This has been the first episode of Say Don't You Remember, a podcast and also a series of videos that we will be publishing on my YouTube channel coming up very soon. The YouTube channel is Anton GF, and my name is Anton Garcia-Fernandez, and mine is the copyright of this broadcast, year 2019, and the podcast was recorded live without any cuts of any kind here in Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be coming back with more people, more artists, more crooners, more actors and actresses that we will remember here on Say Don't You Remember. Thank you so much for now, and so long, everybody.